Hi everyone, in today's episode I want to show you two classic lighting techniques which can be really helpful across a range of situations and locations, and these can be rigged up or rigged down to make them larger or smaller depending on the production needs. The first one I want to look at is the classic book light, which allows us to produce a large soft source with a single hard light. And this is extremely useful for smaller, more confined spaces, or when you don't have larger light sources and modifiers such as softboxes and lanterns. To achieve this, we need to bounce the hard light source across a piece of reflective material, and then diffuse that bounced light across the subject by using some kind of diffusion fabric, such as a magic cloth, unbleached muslin, or even a bed sheet as a super cheap option. This allows us to wrap the light source around a subject, providing a more subtle transition between the light and shadow regions, and reduces the risk of potential hotspots. So how do we set up a book light? Well, once our subject is positioned in frame, we want to take our hard light source, in my case I'm using an aperture 300x, and we're going to point it away from the subject and direct the beam into a reflective bounce board, which we're going to mount onto a C-stand. Now I'm going to mount this bounce board using either a Mathilini clamp or a platypus clamp, and this will keep it nice and secure, especially if I need to adjust the position of the bounce later on. To reduce any light being blocked when bouncing the light, I'll normally move the source slightly out to the side, or you could lower the light and point it slightly upwards. So now I'm going to turn the light on and angle it into the bounce board, and we'll see that this is now spilling onto our subject. But at this stage, it's creating quite a harsh spill. So to amend this, we need to complete the book light setup by adding the diffusion cloth in between the bounced light and the subject. And I've connected this via C-stands and Mathilini clamps. If you don't have something like this, a simple bed sheet or cotton fabric are also great choices. And if you don't have access to things like Mathilini clamps, then bulldog clips or simple clothes pegs or our trusted gaffer tape can also get the job done. Once this is in position, the source is going to bounce off the reflector, be diffused via the cloth, and create a large soft light source. Now book lighting will scatter and spread the light because the light isn't being channeled and focused into a specific area. It's flooding the light across a large surface. So in order to block out any unwanted spill and create more direction, we can use black flags, floppies, or even normal black cloth or card, and these can help cut the light and create some negative fill, and can also help us angle the light to create specific pockets of illumination. Remember, contrast is our friend. Often we want variances of light levels. Now book lights will often have a lot of light fall off because the source is moving across multiple surfaces before it reaches the subject. So try and use the most powerful lights you can. And if you have reflectors or Fresnels, use them, as it will boost the light's brightness. So I want to show you this clip uncut and explain each lighting choice. So first, we've turned on a practical lamp, and this is creating separation across the foreground and background and creating a warm direction of light across the frame. And this is set at around 3000 Kelvin. This is also starting to build the beginning of the rim and fill light. Now this practical light isn't particularly powerful, so to illuminate some areas of interest below the lamp, I'm going to use a Dado 150 outside of frame, which will help fill out the light source and create some extra interest in the background. And this is also set at 3200 Kelvin to closely match the bulb. Next, we've got a Dado 150 situated outside of the set, which has been pointed through an open window. And this has a lens projector attached with a Venetian blind stencil mounted via a gobo. And this helps to create some more interest on the background and create a backlight which helps separate the subject. Next, we've turned on an aperture tube light and set this up just outside of frame. And we've angled it down, which is providing the bulk of our rim and fill across the frame. And again, this is set to 3200 Kelvin. To further build out the frame and help emphasize the direction of the light, we've also turned on a second table lamp closer to the subject at a similar Kelvin temperature. This just helps further sell the effect. All of these lights appear as very warm because the camera's Kelvin value has been set to 5300 Kelvin. Finally, we've now turned on the book light. This is an aperture 300x, which is set to a daylight temperature of 5300 Kelvin, matching the camera's Kelvin temperature.
This light source is being pushed onto the white bounce board, and this is then moving through the diffusion sheet, creating a large soft light source across the subject. This also provides a neutral daylight color contrast to the warmer color temperatures. For additional context, I placed a diagram on screen now, which is showing the setup and placement of each light source.
Okay, so the next lighting setup I want to look at is Cove Lighting. For me, Cove Lighting is very much an adaptation of the book light, but with some additional tweaks. And this allows us to build an even larger surface area, normally between 90 to 180 degrees, and have a greater level of control over more lights. This provides us with gradual gradation, which can produce a very natural and pleasing quality of light, as it wraps around the subject and falls off the subject. And personally for me, I prefer the Cove light over the book light. They both have their place in a lighting technician's repertoire, but I just find myself wanting to use the Cove light across more situations. To set this up, I'll first position my talent, and then in the background, I'm going to turn on a practical light. This will help us create some separation between the foreground and the background. It will begin building the mise-en-scène of the scene, and it will give our audience a reference point for where some of the light may be coming from. Now currently the subject is very dark because I've exposed for the practical light to ensure it's not being blown out and losing detail. And I'm shooting this in log to retain as much dynamic range as possible. So next I'm going to create the cove, and I'm going to wrap this around one side of the subject and place it just outside of the camera's frame. This means I'll be able to create a very large soft source very close to the subject. And this also means my lights won't need to be as powerful because they'll be closer. And I'll place a diagram on the screen now to show you the lighting setup that I'm using. For the Cove Light's material, I'm going to be using some unbleached cotton fabric, and I'll mount this across multiple C-stands by placing the gobo arm out horizontally and joining or aligning the multiple rods and clamping the fabric once again with Mathilini clamps. This allows me to arc the fabric around the subject, which will allow me to angle multiple lights in different directions to achieve various degrees of gradation and tonality. So first, I'm going to shine an aperture 60x towards the back of our fabric, and this is going to produce the beginning of our gradual key. This is also going to add additional separation between our subject and the background. Now I'm going to place each of my lights on the ground and mount them via apple boxes with baby pins. This will allow me to make quick adjustments to the angle if needed, and placing them at ground level with the light slightly pointing upwards allows me to mitigate any unwanted shadows and utilize the light most effectively. You can obviously place them higher and point them downwards if you want to, but it might just make it a little harder to mitigate those shadows. So we've got our first light adjusted. Next, we're going to turn on a second light, this time a 300x with a reflector attached. This is now bouncing across the muslin from a second angle, continuing to wrap the light around the subject. Now, if you were trying to create a more dramatic scene, you could leave the lighting setup as is, allowing those more dramatic lighting ratios to remain. However, if you want to create a more subtle lighting ratio, you could continue the Cove light. At this point, if we want to spread the light source further, we can adjust the angle of the existing light sources. And you'll see that it affects how and where the light falls across the subject's face, and this allows us to create different moods. Alternatively, we can also add a third light into the cove, which is what I'm doing in this example. And we can see the light begins to wrap further around the subject and fill in some of the additional shadows. Depending on how dark you want your fill side, this is where you can use a reflector or a fill light to adjust the contrast ratio. Now once the subject is lit, we can begin building out other areas of the background. For example, adding a rim light or a backlight, or illuminating an area of interest. Cove Lighting also allows us to be quicker in our lighting adjustment. Instead of having to move the fabric or pick up a big stand and move it into a different location and adjust its height or attach different modifiers for different effects, we can simply alter the angle of our light and increase or decrease the gradation and roll-off. For pieces to camera, interviews, or scenes involving dialogue in medium and close-up shots, this becomes a versatile and excellent option for lighting. Even with wider shots, a Cove Light setup can still be upscaled to meet the needs of that production, simply by using bigger lights and larger pieces of fabric. Because the fabric provides a large arc, it means we're able to light our subject whether they're stationary or if some movement is required within the space.
Okay, so for this next shot, we're looking at lighting an interior for nighttime and creating a bluer, cooler tone. So first, my camera is set to 3000 Kelvin and the lights have been set to 4200 Kelvin. The first light is a 300x with a reflector attached, which is being cast onto the back wall through the window. This creates a hard shadow and separates the foreground from the background, and bouncing it off a blue wall is also further emphasizing that cooler tone. This also provides a nice silhouette of the subject and some nice hard shadows from the plants. Next, I'm using a similar Cove Light setup as previously seen earlier in the video. However, I've removed one light and cut this down to one 300x and one 60x. The 300x is set at 4200 Kelvin and this is reflecting off the cove and acting as the main key light for the subject. This is also filling out areas of the frame with some illumination, reducing the contrast ratio and allowing us to see more across the frame. Now we still have some deep shadows across the face creating contrast, and we could leave the setup as is if we wanted. However, to add some additional fill and wrap the light further around the subject, I'll turn on the 60x and this will create some additional fill and lower that contrast ratio. To help sell that it's nighttime, the whole scene is exposed at a slightly lower level to make it appear slightly darker, and this in conjunction with the cooler colour temperatures helps suggest the nighttime aesthetic. Now the third light, which was part of the Cove setup earlier in the video, has been repurposed and placed slightly out to the side of the Cove, and is being pointed to the back of the chair, acting as a fill to bring a little bit of visual information back into the darkest shadows. It's subtle, but it's just helping to soften the overall contrast ratio. Finally, to emulate the idea that I'm watching a TV just outside a frame, I've positioned a tube light on a C-stand and set this to its TV special effects, with a colour temperature ranging from 4700 Kelvin to 6500 Kelvin. This allows the colour to remain cooler but shifts it slightly, which provides an obvious but subtle flicker. Then finally, to add some colour contrast and warmth into the scene, I've turned on the lampshade and set this to 2700 Kelvin, which will provide a slightly warmer hue against the camera's 3000 Kelvin. Now, to adjust the same scene for more of a daylight aesthetic, I'm going to adjust the camera's lights from 4200 Kelvin to 3200 Kelvin, and I've changed my camera's Kelvin range from 3000 to 3800. This means the image will appear warmer because the light's Kelvin range is lower than the camera's Kelvin range. This image has also been exposed a little brighter by increasing the intensity of the light sources and increasing the ISO of the camera. Now, if we look at these two images side by side, we can see a drastic difference in the feel of each scene just by changing the exposure values and the Kelvin values. Now, something we can do which can help create a softer image and further emphasize and complement the warmer sunset aesthetic is to add haze into the scene. Now, when you first add haze, it can be incredibly prominent and overbearing, so it's important to let the haze dissipate and reduce within the scene so it appears in a more natural and subtle manner. This also means the haze won't be moving around as much, so it won't be as distracting. It's also a good idea to focus the haze behind the subject, and this will ensure the contrast ratio of the main subject remains intact, while the background can be softened. Now, you can use haze across a variety of angles, however, you'll find it's more prominent when backlighting. For example, in this second shot, as this will allow the light rays to spill through the haze more effectively. So in this next shot, I'm looking at hard top-down lighting. This first light we've turned on is an Aperture 300x with a turquoise theatrical gel attached, and this is being pushed through the side window which has a diffusion sheet across it. This is creating a softer light source which is spread more evenly across the back wall and is providing a more stylized colour which we could play off as part of Blue Hour. The 300x is set at 5600 Kelvin and the camera is set to 3800 Kelvin. This is acting as a bluer and cooler fill light and backlight. Next, we've turned on a lamp, which again provides a warmer color contrast set at 3200 Kelvin. And this helps build some additional interest and motivation across the background. And similar to some earlier shots, I've got a Dado 150 also set at 3200, situated just outside of frame, and this is angled in a certain way that when turned on, only hits the bamboo, and helps create a focus point and helps give the illusion that the light is coming from the practical lamp. Finally, we've now turned on the hard light, and this is coming from the Dado 150, mounted on a C-stand and attached via a Mathilini clamp. The Dado's spotlight function has been adjusted to ensure the light source is only hitting the table, and the table is then acting as a bounce light, which helps illuminate my face. Now this hard light source will create a more dramatic effect, and will throw hard shadows across the subject's face. So this technique can be useful for more dramatic scenes, and is often used in thrillers and horrors to help add suspense. Now, if more light is needed, you could always take an additional light outside of frame and point it into the subject to further reduce the shadows. However, you can also use practical objects to create a bounce directly in the scene. For example, in this shot, I've opened a book and I'm using a bounce directly from the white paper to fill in some of the shadows. And you can see that this adds a lot of additional light. Once again, here's another diagram showing the lighting setup for this scene. Now, if you want a softer and more even light source, you can swap out a hard light for a soft light. In this example, I've swapped out the Dado 150 for an Aperture 60X with a lantern attached. The lantern allows a soft spill of light to occur across a wide angle, and this means it's able to fill in a lot of the hard shadows which occur when using the hard light source. Now, because the 60X with the lantern is heavier than the Dado, I've had to alter the rigging a little, and use two C-stands on either side, and join them with an extra gobo and arm, and use a Mathilini clamp and a safety chain to secure the light. Ideally, I would have preferred to use a junior boom arm on a combo stand, but I didn't have one available. However, that would normally be the option I'd choose. This helps reduce overall rigging and kit, and would allow me to mount a greater variance of lights. In this example, all of the lights and color temperatures have stayed the same, and if we need some extra fill, we can still use the physical objects as a bounce, such as the book, and once again, here's a diagram of that lighting setup. Now, as well as a single person, lanterns are also excellent for lighting two people at the same time. This is because it's able to act as a key for both subjects when they're across from one another. This can help produce more even lighting, but it also makes the setup and rigging process easier, and means you can utilize fewer lights, which can be really useful if you're on a tight budget, or have a limited amount of space available in that location. However, lanterns do need a decent amount of headroom to ensure that they can stay out of frame, so this is just something to be aware of. Again, the nice thing about lanterns is that they produce a really soft and even light, and because they can spread the light across a larger angle, they're also able to add additional illumination and brighten more of the overall scene. In addition, depending on where the subjects are in relation to the angle of the lantern, this will determine whether the lantern is acting as a primary key and providing broadside lighting, in which the shadows are falling away from the camera, and so the subject's face is lit on camera side, or short side lighting, in which the shadows are falling towards the camera and the subject's face is more prominently in shadow on the camera's side. Finally, for this shot, I wanted to look at stylistic color and adding haze. Now I've got two 300Xs outside of the window with a blue theatrical gel attached. And then we've also got some haze coming through from a haze machine, and this is allowing the light streaks to appear within the frame, and it's adding a bit of atmosphere to the scene. Now the theatrical blue color mixed with the warm tungsten lights gives a nice dramatic look, and it gives a lot of richness and a lot of contrast and a lot of high saturation within the frame. So let's look at the lighting setup. We've got two 300Xs coming through the Venetian blinds, and these are set at 5600 Kelvin, and they have a blue theatrical gel attached to each. We then have the two lamps within the scene, the larger lampshade and the smaller lamp on the table. These are both set to 3200 Kelvin. We then have the camera, and that's set at 4500 Kelvin, which is allowing the lamps within the scene to appear as warmer because the Kelvin is a lower value, and the lights outside of frame, the two 300Xs, are going to appear as cooler because the Kelvin range is higher on those. We also have two Data 150s just outside of frame, and they're acting as accent lights, which are providing some additional illumination for both lampshades, and these are pointed at the two different plants. The Data 150, which is pointed towards the larger lampshade, is also illuminating my face as I move into the frame and begin drawing on the canvas. And this is creating a nice warm hue across my skin tones, and it makes it appear as though this light is coming from the smaller lampshade on the table. Finally, I also have the bounce board, which is just allowing a little bit of light to reflect back into the scene, just to create a little bit of subtle fill.
So hopefully you can use some of these techniques to level up your lighting, and it's given you some ideas on how you can use your lights more effectively. Cheers for watching, keep being creative, and I'll see you soon.